The first time Grace Bennett told me no, I was worth $2 billion and I still didn't know what to do with my own hands. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 38, I run a logistics and freight technology company that started in my garage and now moves cargo across 4 continents, and by the time this story starts, I had forgotten what it felt like to want something I couldn't simply buy, schedule, or acquire. I wasn't cold. I want to be clear about that from the start, because people hear billionaire and they picture a man in a glass office sneering at waiters. I was just tired in a way money never touched. My wife, Diane, had died 3 years earlier, a car accident on a wet highway on a Tuesday that started like every other Tuesday, and after that, I had one job left that actually mattered to me. Raising our daughter, Lily, and making sure she didn't grow up thinking grief was something you scheduled around. Everything else in my life ran like a machine. My calendar ran like a machine. My board ran like a machine, mostly because I built it to. But Lily was 7 years old and stubborn and funny in a way that reminded me so much of her mother it physically hurt some mornings, and she was the one part of my life I refused to hand off to an assistant. Which is how I ended up sitting in a plastic chair built for a 6-year-old, knees nearly at my chest, at Maple Hollow Elementary on a Thursday afternoon in October, waiting for a first-grade teacher named Grace Bennett to tell me my daughter was struggling. I want you to understand something about my week before that meeting. I had closed a $400 million shipping contract on Monday. I had fired a regional director on Tuesday for cutting corners on driver safety inspections. I had flown to Chicago and back on Wednesday for a board dinner I didn't want to attend. And on Thursday, none of that mattered, because my daughter's teacher had called my office directly instead of going through my assistant, and said 4 words that rearranged my entire schedule. I'd like to talk. Not urgent, not alarming, just direct. My assistant, Marissa, had actually laughed a little when she relayed it, because apparently Ms. Bennett had refused to be redirected to a phone call or a video meeting. She'd said, and Marissa read this to me word for word, if Mr. Cole has time to build a logistics empire, he has time to sit in a classroom for 20 minutes. I remember sitting at my desk reading that message twice. Nobody talked to me like that anymore. Not employees, not board members, not the string of women my sister kept trying to introduce me to at charity dinners. Everyone around me had learned to soften their language, to package their requests, to remember who they were talking to. This woman I had never met had sent a message that sounded like an order. I showed up anyway. Maple Hollow Elementary smelled like pencil shavings and industrial floor cleaner, and the hallway outside Lily's classroom was covered in construction paper leaves with kids' names written in shaky crayon letters. I found Lily's leaf near the door, orange with glitter glue that hadn't fully dried, and I stood there for a second longer than I needed to, because something about seeing her name in that hallway made her feel like a real 7-year-old instead of the fragile thing I was always trying to protect. Then the classroom door opened, and Grace Bennett stepped out. She wasn't what I expected, though I'm not sure what I expected. She was maybe 30, brown hair pulled back in a low knot with pieces falling loose around her face like she'd stopped fighting them hours ago, wearing a cardigan with a small paint stain near the cuff and flat shoes built for standing all day, not for impressing anyone. She had the kind of face that didn't perform. No practiced warmth, no nervous over-smiling at the men whose name was on half the trucks that rolled through 3 states. She just looked at me like I was exactly what I was. A parent who was late enough times that she'd had to schedule this conversation twice. "Mr. Cole," she said, and there was no flinch in it, no softening. "Thank you for coming. You made it sound mandatory." It was. I almost laughed. Nobody had said something that flatly true to my face in longer than I could remember. I followed her into the classroom, folding myself into one of those small chairs across a table covered in colored pencils and half-finished worksheets, and she sat across from me with a folder already open. "Lily is bright," she said. "I want to start there because I don't want you walking out of here thinking I called you in to tell you your daughter is failing. She isn't. She's one of the sharpest kids in my class when she wants to be. But she's been distracted. Distant, some days. She draws instead of doing her work, and when I ask her about it, she tells me she's drawing her mom." Grace paused there, and for the first time I saw something soften in her face, not pity exactly, something steadier than that. "I looked into her file before I called you. I know about your wife. I'm sorry. I should have said that first." I sat back in the small chair, feeling it creak under my weight. Most people lead with the sympathy. You led with the problem. The problem is what helps her. The sympathy is for you, and you didn't come here for that. I looked at her for a long second. In every meeting I'd sat in for the past 3 years, people handled me like something breakable, like grief made me a liability they had to manage carefully. Grace Bennett had just told me, without a shred of cruelty, that my daughter needed something from me and my feelings could wait their turn. What does she need? I asked. Consistency. Not extravagance. Not more toys or another vacation. I'm guessing those aren't in short supply. A small, dry note in her voice, not quite a joke, not quite an accusation. She needs you present in small, ordinary ways. Reading with her at night. Being at pickup sometimes instead of a driver. Small things that tell her the world is still steady even though it broke once. I didn't say anything for a moment. My throat had gone tight in a way I wasn't prepared for, sitting in a plastic chair built for children, being told by a stranger in a cardigan that my daughter needed less of my money and more of my time. I had heard some version of that advice from a grief counselor, from my sister, from Diane's mother. It had never landed the way it landed sitting across from Grace Bennett, mostly because she didn't say it gently. She said it like a fact she expected me to be capable of handling. I can do that, I said. I know you can. The question was never whether you're capable, Mr. Cole. It's whether you'll choose to. That sentence followed me out of the building. It followed me into my car, into the following week, into board meetings where men twice my age deferred to me on 9-figure decisions while I sat there thinking about a teacher in a paint-stained cardigan who hadn't deferred to me on anything at all. I started showing up to pick up 3 days a week after that. Not because Grace Bennett had shamed me into it, though maybe a little of that was true, but because the first time I stood at the classroom door and watched Lily's face light up when she saw me instead of my driver, I understood exactly what I'd been missing while I told myself the company needed me more urgently than she did. Grace noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything about the classroom, the kids who needed an extra 5 minutes at recess, the ones who needed to be seated near the window, the ones who needed silence instead of attention. She started nodding at me when I came to pick up Lily, small and businesslike at first, then slowly less businesslike, though neither of us called it anything. She drew a house today, Grace told me one Tuesday, walking me the 10 feet from the classroom door to where Lily was gathering her backpack. Not a mansion. A regular house. With 3 people in it. I looked down at the drawing Lily handed me a second later, crayon lines, a stick figure man, a stick figure girl, and a stick figure woman with brown hair standing a little apart from the other 2 but still inside the picture. Who's that? I asked Lily, pointing to the third figure, mostly out of curiosity, not expecting the answer that came. That's Miss Bennett, Lily said, like it was obvious. She's nice. She smells like cinnamon. I glanced up and caught Grace's expression, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she smoothed it back into something professional. Kids draw their favorite people, she said quickly. It doesn't mean anything. I didn't say it did, I said, though something in my chest disagreed with both of us. Over the following weeks, small ordinary moments started accumulating between Grace and me the way sediment builds a riverbed, one grain at a time, invisible until you looked back and saw the whole shape of it. She started keeping me updated with more than the required parent-teacher emails, small notes about Lily's day, a joke she'd made in class, a book she'd loved. I started arriving a few minutes early to pick up, not because I needed to, but because those few minutes standing in the hallway talking to Grace Bennett about nothing in particular had become the steadiest part of my week. I noticed things about her I had no business noticing. The way she crouched down to a kid's eye level instead of talking down at them. The way she remembered which parents were divorced and adjusted her language around custody without making it a production. The way she carried a coffee thermos that had clearly been refilled from the teacher's lounge pod at least twice by early afternoon, and drank it anyway because there wasn't time for anything better. One afternoon in November, I found her in the school parking lot standing beside a car with its hood up, staring at the engine like it had personally betrayed her. Car trouble, I said, pulling my own car alongside hers. Very astute observation, Mr. Cole. Ethan, I said. You've met my daughter's finger paintings. I think we're past Mr. Cole. That got the smallest crack of a smile out of her, the first unguarded one I'd seen. Fine. Ethan. And yes, my car is apparently done being a car. I could have called someone. I had people whose entire job was solving exactly this kind of problem with one phone call. Instead, I got out, rolled up my sleeves, and looked at the engine myself, because some part of me wanted to be a man who fixed things with his hands in front of her rather than a man who fixed things with his wallet. It turned out to be nothing complicated, a battery cable that had worked itself loose, the kind of thing any competent adult could handle in 5 minutes with the right tools. I happened to have jumper cables in my trunk, a habit left over from a childhood where my father drove trucks for a living before I built a company that owned thousands of them. "You carry jumper cables," Grace said, watching me work. "In a car that costs more than my apartment building." My dad drilled it into me. Never be the guy stranded on the side of the road because he assumed someone else would handle it. Something shifted in her expression at that, like I'd handed her a piece of information that didn't match the picture she'd built of me. "That's not what I expected you to say." "What did you expect me to say?" "Something about calling a service. Being too important to get your hands dirty." I closed the hood and wiped my hands on a rag from the trunk, feeling grease settle into the creases of my palms in a way that felt more honest than anything I'd done in a boardroom that month. "I built the company that owns half the trucks running freight through this state. I know what it's like to have grease on your hands for a living, even if I don't do it anymore. Don't confuse money with forgetting where you came from." Grace looked at me for a long moment, longer than felt purely practical, and something passed between us that neither of us named out loud. Then she thanked me, quietly, and got into her working car, and drove off, and I stood in that parking lot a beat too long, feeling something I hadn't felt in 3 years, which was simply wanting to see someone again. The trouble started, as trouble usually does, with people who had never spoken a single word to Grace Bennett but had a great deal to say about her anyway. My sister, Vanessa, called it inappropriate before she'd even met her, which told me everything about how fast gossip travels through a small town when the gossip involves a billionaire and his daughter's teacher standing a little too close in a school parking lot. Someone from the PTA had seen us. Someone else had seen my car outside the school more often than the other parents' cars. By December, half of Maple Hollow apparently had an opinion about what was or wasn't happening between Ethan Cole and Grace Bennett, and none of them had bothered to ask either of us. "You need to be careful," Vanessa told me over dinner one night, the kind of dinner she scheduled specifically to deliver opinions I hadn't asked for. "People are talking. The board is talking. Do you understand what it looks like, a man in your position getting cozy with his daughter's teacher?" "It looks like a father who shows up for pickup," I said. "That's what it looks like, because that's what it is." "Ethan." She set down her fork with the particular precision she used when she wanted me to know she was being patient with me. "You have a merger with Hargrove Freight coming up in the spring. Do you know what Richard Hargrove said to me at the club last week? He said his daughter Amara asked about you. That's a real opportunity, Ethan. A partnership that makes sense on paper and in the press. Not some schoolteacher with a coffee-stained cardigan who has nothing to bring to a life like yours." I set my own fork down harder than I meant to. "You've never met her. I don't need to meet her to understand the optics." The optics. I let that word sit in the air a second, tasting how small it felt next to the actual person it was describing. "Vanessa, that woman has spent more time thinking about my daughter's well-being in the last 2 months than half the people at your club have thought about anything besides their own reflection. Don't talk to me about optics like they're worth more than the person underneath them." She didn't have a response for that, not immediately, which was rare for my sister. But I knew the conversation wasn't over. It never was, not with Vanessa, not when she'd already decided what shape my life should take. The board pressure came next, dressed up in language about brand image and shareholder confidence, though everyone in that room understood exactly what they were really discussing. Richard Hargrove himself showed up at a quarterly meeting I hadn't expected him at, and after the numbers were reviewed and the projections were approved, he leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been told no in a room full of people who needed his money. "Ethan," he said, like we were old friends instead of business acquaintances circling a deal. "My Amara speaks highly of you. I think a partnership between our companies could extend to more than freight routes, if you're open to that kind of conversation." I looked around the table at faces that were carefully neutral, waiting to see how I'd respond to being handed a business arrangement disguised as a romantic suggestion. "I appreciate the sentiment, Richard, but my personal life isn't a line item for this board to negotiate." "Nobody's negotiating," he said smoothly. "Just noting that certain arrangements tend to strengthen certain deals. And certain other arrangements." His eyes flicked briefly toward the door, like he already knew exactly what had been whispered about Grace Bennett in the halls outside that boardroom, tend to weaken them. The room went quiet in that particular corporate way, everyone watching to see if I'd bend. I thought about Grace crouched at a child's eye level, correcting a stubborn 7-year-old's math homework without an ounce of performance in it. I thought about jumper cables and grease on my hands and a woman who had never once asked me what my net worth was. "I'll take that under advisement," I said, which was corporate language for absolutely not, and Richard Hargrove understood it exactly that way, judging by the way his jaw tightened before he recovered his smile. That night, I drove to Grace's apartment for the first time, not because anything had happened between us yet, not officially, but because I needed to see her, and I was done pretending I didn't. She opened the door in sweatpants and an old college sweatshirt, hair loose around her shoulders instead of pinned back, looking startled to find me on her doorstep at 8 at night. "Ethan. Is Lily okay?" "She's fine. She's with her grandmother tonight." I stood there a second, feeling for the first time in years like I didn't know exactly what to say. "I wanted to see you. That's the whole reason. I don't have a better one." Something moved across her face, surprise first, then something warier underneath it. "People are talking, you know. About us." "I know. I don't want Lily caught in the middle of gossip because her father wanted to visit her teacher after dark." "That's not what this is," I said. "Grace, I've spent 3 years going through the motions of my own life. Showing up to meetings I didn't care about, sitting across from women my sister picked out because they photographed well next to me at events, and none of it ever made me feel the way 20 minutes in a hallway with you does. I'm not here because it's convenient. I'm here because I can't stop thinking about you, and I'd rather say that plainly than pretend otherwise." She was quiet for a long moment, arms crossed loosely, the porch light throwing soft shadows across her face. "You have a board that wants you married into another freight company. A sister who's already decided who you should be with. A whole town that's going to have opinions about a teacher dating one of her students' fathers. I know all of that. And you're standing on my porch anyway." "I am." She looked at me a long moment, and I watched something in her expression shift from guarded to something gentler, though not fully open, not yet. "I'm not going to be a secret, Ethan. I won't sneak around edges of your life because it's easier for your board or your sister. If this is something, it has to be honest, out loud, in the light. Otherwise it isn't worth either of us risking anything for." "Agreed," I said, and I meant it more fully than I'd meant almost anything in 3 years. "No hiding. Whatever this costs, we pay it honestly." She stepped back from the door then, not quite an invitation, but not a rejection either. "Then maybe you should come in. I have terrible coffee and worse opinions about your sister, apparently, and we might as well have both out in the open." I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had in longer than I wanted to admit, and followed her inside. The weeks after that were quiet in the way that only comes before a storm, though neither of us knew the storm was coming yet. We saw each other carefully, deliberately, never hiding but never announcing either, mostly because Grace insisted Lily's world stay steady while we figured out what we were building. I picked Lily up from school and sometimes Grace joined us for dinner afterward, nothing performative, just a woman helping a little girl with her homework at my kitchen table while I made grilled cheese sandwiches because it turned out that was the one thing in my kitchen I actually knew how to cook well. Lily adored her, in the uncomplicated way kids adore people who take them seriously. She started drawing that same picture over and over, the stick figure house with 3 people in it, except now Grace wasn't standing apart from the other 2 figures. She was standing between them, holding both their hands. "Does that bother you?" I asked Grace one evening, showing her the newest drawing. "Being drawn into a family that isn't officially yours." Grace studied the picture for a long moment, something soft and a little frightened moving across her face. "It doesn't bother me. It terrifies me a little, if I'm honest. Because if this doesn't work, it isn't just my heart that gets broken. It's hers too, and I refuse to be one more person in that little girl's life who disappears." "Then let's make sure it works," I said, and she looked at me like she wanted to believe that was a promise I could actually keep. The storm came in January, at the winter concert, of all places, a gymnasium full of parents watching first graders murder a rendition of a song about snowflakes, and it came in the form of Vanessa walking in wearing a coat that cost more than most of the folding chairs in that room combined, with Amara Hargrove on her arm like a prop she'd brought specifically to make a point. I saw them the second they walked in, and I felt my stomach drop the way it used to before a hostile board vote. Grace was up near the front, helping wrangle 22 overexcited 6- and 7-year-olds into a semi-organized line, completely unaware of what had just walked through the door. Vanessa found me at intermission, Amara trailing behind her with the polite, uncomfortable expression of someone who'd been talked into an ambush she didn't fully agree with. I thought it was time Amara saw what all the fuss was about, Vanessa said, voice pitched just loud enough to carry. Meet the teacher who's apparently worth risking a merger over. Vanessa. My voice came out low, warning. What? I'm being direct. Isn't that what you like about her? Directness. She turned toward Grace, who had come over at the sound of raised voices, Lily's hand still in hers from hurting the class. You must be Miss Bennett. I've heard so much about you. Coffee stains and all. Grace's expression didn't crack, though I saw something flicker behind her eyes, a familiar old wound getting pressed on by a stranger who had no idea what she was touching. I'm sorry, I don't think we've met. Vanessa Cole. Ethan's sister. And this is Amara Hargrove, whose father happens to control a merger my brother's company desperately needs. Vanessa's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I just think it's important everyone understands what's actually at stake here before this goes any further. A teacher's salary against a company worth $2 billion. It's not exactly a fair fight, is it? The gymnasium around us hadn't gone silent, not entirely, but enough parents nearby had caught the tension in the air to start glancing over. Lily, still holding Grace's hand, looked up with the confused, worried expression kids get when they sense adults fighting but don't understand why. I stepped forward, close enough that Vanessa had to look up at me. That's enough. I'm only saying what everyone's already thinking, Ethan. No, I said, you're saying what you think, and you're saying it in front of my daughter and a room full of parents because you wanted an audience for it. That's not the same thing as truth, and you know it. Grace's voice, when it came, was steady and quiet, the same voice she used correcting stubborn 7-year-olds who thought they knew better. Ms. Cole, I understand you're worried about your brother's business. That's a fair thing to worry about. But I didn't ask him for a merger, and I didn't ask him for $2 billion. I asked him to read with his daughter at night. Everything after that was his choice, not mine, and I won't apologize for a choice that wasn't mine to make. Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed, clearly having expected either tears or a fight and gotten neither. Amara Hargrove, to her credit, looked deeply uncomfortable with the entire scene, and finally said, quietly, Vanessa, maybe we should go find our seats. But Vanessa wasn't finished. You think you can just walk into his life and change everything, don't you? Do you have any idea what you're actually taking on? The press, the board, people like me who will never fully accept you no matter how many crayon drawings my niece makes of you. Grace let go of Lily's hand gently, crouching down to the little girl's eye level first. Hey, sweetheart, can you go find your line? Your class is about to sing again. Lily nodded, glancing between the adults with worried eyes, then scurried off toward her classmates. Only then did Grace stand and look Vanessa full in the face. I don't need you to accept me, Grace said, calm and clear enough that the parents nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. I need your brother to be honest about what he wants, and I need his daughter to feel safe. That's all I've ever asked for. If that threatens a business deal, then maybe the deal was never as solid as you think it is. I watched something shift in Vanessa's face, not quite defeat, but a recalculation, the look of a woman who had walked in expecting an easy target and found something sturdier than she'd planned for. This isn't over, she said, though the words had lost most of their heat. It is for tonight, I said. My daughter is about to sing about snowflakes, and I intend to watch her do it instead of standing here arguing with you. If you want to talk business, call my office tomorrow. If you want to talk about Grace, you can address her directly and respectfully, or not at all. Vanessa looked at me for a long moment, something almost like surprise in her expression, like she was seeing a version of her brother she hadn't accounted for. Then she turned and walked toward the folding chairs without another word, Amara following a step behind her, throwing one apologetic glance back over her shoulder. Grace exhaled slowly beside me, hands trembling slightly at her sides even though her voice hadn't shaken once. That was not how I pictured meeting your sister. Me neither, I said. For what it's worth, you handled it better than I would have. I had motivation. She looked toward the front of the gymnasium where Lily was climbing back into her spot in line, glancing back at us with worried eyes until Grace gave her a small reassuring wave. I wasn't going to let that little girl watch adults tear each other apart in front of her, not over something that isn't even complicated. Either you want to be with me or you don't. Everything else is noise. I want to be with you, I said, and for the first time I said it without any hedge in my voice, without any part of me holding something back for the board, for Vanessa, for the version of my life everyone else had already written for me. I've wanted that for a while now. I was just being careful. I think I'm done being careful. She looked at me, something vulnerable moving across her face before she caught it. Careful got us here. I don't need reckless, Ethan. I just need honest. Then here's honest, I said. I love you. I don't know exactly when it happened, somewhere between a jumper cable in a school parking lot and a crayon drawing of a house with 3 people in it, but it happened, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise for the sake of a merger my company doesn't actually need. The gymnasium lights dimmed for the next number before she could answer, and we stood there in the half-dark, watching Lily's class shuffle back into position, her voice about to join 20 other off-key 7-year-olds murdering a song about snowflakes, and Grace slipped her hand into mine, quiet and certain, and that was answer enough. The merger with Hargrove Freight fell apart 3 weeks later, though not for the reasons Vanessa had feared. Richard Hargrove called it off himself, in a conversation that was almost embarrassingly civil given the circumstances. I'll be honest, Ethan, he said over the phone, I proposed that arrangement because I thought it made good business sense, and I didn't think much beyond that. My daughter told me last week she has no interest in being handed off like a contract clause, and frankly, I respect her too much to argue with that. We can still do business together. Just business, this time. I'd like that, I said, and meant it, because Richard Hargrove without the matchmaking agenda turned out to be a perfectly reasonable person to work with, and the deal we eventually signed that spring was stronger for being built on actual terms instead of a marriage neither of his daughter nor I had ever wanted. Vanessa took longer to come around, the way people who are used to being right take longer to admit when they've been wrong. It happened gradually, not with some dramatic apology, but in smaller ways. She started asking real questions about Grace instead of assumptions. She showed up to Lily's next school event without an agenda. And one evening in March, she called me, her voice quieter than I'd heard it in years. I watched her with Lily at the science fair last week, Vanessa said. The way she talked to her, the way she talked to all those kids, actually. I don't think I've ever seen anyone look at a room full of 7-year-olds like they each individually mattered that much. A pause. I was wrong about her, Ethan. I was scared for you, and I turned that fear into something ugly, and I'm sorry. Thank you for saying that. Don't get used to it. I still think you should have introduced us properly instead of letting me find out from the PTA gossip chain. Noted for next time, I said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my sister and I laughed together instead of arguing. Grace and I took things slowly after that, deliberately, the way she'd insisted from the beginning. No headline announcements, no staged photos for the company newsletter, just an ordinary unfolding life built one Tuesday pickup and one Sunday pancake breakfast at a time. She kept teaching, refused every suggestion that she quit and let me support her, told me plainly that her classroom was not a hobby she'd abandoned for a bank account, and I respected that too much to push. I started coaching Lily's soccer team on weekends, badly, with Grace on the sideline laughing at every mistake I made, and somewhere in those small unglamorous Saturdays, I found the life I hadn't realized I'd been missing since Diane died. There was one evening that spring I still think about more than almost any other, a Tuesday like 100 other Tuesdays, except Grace had stayed late grading papers and I'd driven over with takeout instead of waiting for her at home. I found her at her classroom desk under a single lamp, a stack of spelling tests in front of her, red pen capped and resting against her cheek like she'd been thinking too hard to keep writing. You look like a woman who needs dumplings more than she needs another spelling test, I said, setting the bag down on the corner of her desk. She looked up, tired in that particular way teachers get tired, worn thin by 22 small people who each needed something different from her every single hour of the day, and something in her face loosened just seeing me standing there. I have 4 kids in this class who can't tell the difference between there and there no matter how many times I explain it, and I have started to take it personally. They're 6. I'm aware of their age, Ethan. That doesn't make it less personal. But she was smiling by then, pulling the container of noodles toward her, and we sat together in that empty classroom with the hallway lights dimmed and the construction paper leaves rustling faintly every time the heating vent kicked on, And I remember thinking that I had sat in boardrooms worth more money than most countries' GDPs, and none of them had ever made me feel as unhurried and as certain as a folding chair in an empty first-grade classroom with grease pencil marks still faintly visible on the whiteboard behind her. "Can I ask you something?" I said, somewhere around the second carton of noodles. "You can ask." I reserve the right not to answer. "Are you happy? Actually happy, not just managing, not just handling things the way you handle everything else in your life?" Grace set her chopsticks down slowly, considering the question with the same seriousness she gave every single thing, whether it was a marriage proposal or a first grader's math homework. I spent a long time telling myself I was happy because I was needed. Kids need me here every day, and there's a kind of comfort in being necessary. But that's different from being happy. She looked up at me, and there was nothing guarded in her expression, not anymore, not after everything we'd already survived together. This, though. Bad noodles in an empty classroom with a man who drove across town instead of just calling me. This is happy. I didn't expect it to look this ordinary. I think I assumed happiness would announce itself more. "I used to think that too," I said. "Turns out it mostly just shows up quietly and stays, if you let it." She reached across the desk and took my hand, ink-stained fingers wrapping around mine, and we sat there until the custodian came through to lock up, laughing about nothing in particular, and I drove home that night with the specific, settled feeling of a man who has finally stopped waiting for his life to catch up with him and realized it already had. A year after that first parent-teacher conference, I proposed to Grace in the exact classroom where we'd met, after hours, with the desks pushed aside and Lily's construction paper leaf still hanging crookedly on the wall outside, though by then Lily was in second grade and had a different teacher whose classroom she liked well enough but never talked about with the same light in her eyes. I got down on one knee on the industrial tile floor that smelled faintly of pencil shavings and told Grace that she had walked into my life refusing to soften anything for my money or my title, and that was exactly why I never wanted to spend another year without her in it. She cried before she said yes, which she later insisted didn't count against her toughness, and I promised her I'd never repeat that story to Vanessa, a promise I broke almost immediately because some things are too good not to share. Lily was the one who insisted on being in the room when Grace and I told her the news officially, sitting between us at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and her favorite crayons already out, like she'd been expecting this moment for a while. She drew the same house she'd been drawing for over a year, except this time she added a fourth figure, small, with a crayon scribble of dark hair. "Who's that?" Grace asked, though I think she already suspected the answer. "That's the new baby," Lily said matter-of-factly, like she was stating a fact rather than a hope. "You have to have one eventually. That's how families work." Grace looked at me over our daughter's head, laughing so hard she had to wipe her eyes, and I sat there thinking that somewhere along the way, a woman in a paint-stained cardigan who refused to be intimidated by my net worth had rebuilt something in me I thought had died on a wet highway 3 years earlier, and she'd done it not with grand gestures or extravagant promises, but with jumper cables, honest sentences, and a refusal to let anyone, including me, treat her like she was less than. Exactly who she was. We got married the following summer in the school gymnasium, of all places, because Grace insisted it was the only building that actually meant something to both of us, string lights instead of fluorescent tubes, folding chairs dressed up with white fabric, and Lily walking down the aisle scattering rose petals with the same fierce concentration she brought to every math worksheet Grace had ever corrected. Vanessa gave a toast that made most of the room cry, admitting openly that she'd once tried to talk me out of the best decision I ever made, and thanking Grace for being stubborn enough not to let her succeed. Richard Hargrove sent a very nice gift and a card that read, simply, "Glad it worked out the right way," which I appreciated more than he probably realized. People still ask us sometimes how we met, usually expecting some elaborate story fitting the size of the company I run, and Grace always tells it the same simple way. She says a distracted little girl kept drawing pictures of her mother, and her father finally showed up to talk about it, and that was the whole beginning, nothing more dramatic than a man learning to be present and a teacher who refused to let him get away with less than that. I usually add the part she leaves out, that somewhere in a school parking lot with a dead car battery, I learned that the richest thing in my life had never been the company, and it took a woman who couldn't have cared less about my bank account to teach me that lesson properly. So let me ask you something before you go. Have you ever met someone who refused to be impressed by everything the world told you should be impressive, and ended up being exactly the person who changed your life because of it? Have you ever had someone see straight through the version of you everyone else was too intimidated to challenge, and love the real one instead? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and honestly, some of them are better than the ones I write. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.